I'm Professor Anne Wiechmann, and I'm speaking to you from Lancaster in the north of England. And I will be in conversation today with Professor David Crystal, who is an Emeritus Professor of Linguistics and author of very, very many books on the English language. His latest book is on conversation, and I'm delighted to welcome him today from his home in North Wales to have a conversation with him about conversation. There are many questions to be asked. What is it? Why do we do it? How do we learn it? What are the conventions? And what about virtual conversations like this one? So I'm going to start by asking David, what is conversation and why do we have them?
Well, one of the first things you do when you're having a conversation is you greet each other. And of course, I'm now greeting all you people in Brazil and maybe further afield, of course. So, bom dia to you. I remember very happily many visits to Brazil some years ago. And it's lovely to be back there, virtually at least. I'm afraid the computer system is not yet up to sending me some caipirinha or anything like that, but we'll do our best without it. And thank you, Anne. Thank you for that introduction. And indeed, this response to it is one of the most important things about a conversation, because in a conversation, you have to start bonding with the other people that you are conversing with. If it's just one person, that can usually be done quite quickly. With a group, it might take longer. With an unknown number of people that I can't see, of course, you do still need that little bit of easing one's way in before we start talking seriously. And there's another reason, and that is that people's attention span, the way people attend to anything, especially in a somewhat artificial context like this, attention takes a little while to establish itself. There's a basic principle about eloquence when you're giving a lecture or a talk or something like that. Never say anything important in the first half a minute, because in that first half a minute, people are getting used to your voice and they're settling down and all the rest of it. Wait until that's gone by, and then we can get into it. Well, I've now waffled on for about a minute now, so I think at this point we can start talking more about other things. But that first minute or so is very important, don't you think?
I do, and it's a pity that that very first minute contained all the nice things I said about you.
Yes, people have to get used to your voice as well as mine, and indeed the pace of the interaction, because always with internet conversations, unlike in everyday life, there's a bit of a lag, isn't there, which depends on the internet speed and things like that. It's not bad at the moment. Zoom is very good from this point of view, but you never quite know about, like you're doing now, about when to chip in and me when to respond. There's always that difficulty, isn't there?
There is, and I think quite a few people have said recently that Zoom conversations are actually harder work than normal conversations. I'm not certain why.
Yes, they are. And the basic reason is that simultaneous feedback is largely missing. Now, in everyday conversation, when you're talking to somebody face to face, you are doing all the speaking and the other person is listening, but the other person is also being very active. The other person is nodding while you speak, or shaking their head, or saying aha, and all of these things. And you pick these cues up, this simultaneous feedback, you pick it up, you assimilate it, and you immediately respond to it. So if somebody suddenly starts going, oh, then you think, oh, what's happening? Now, in this particular situation, that simultaneous feedback is virtually impossible. Although I can see you, Anne, you are in a screen down below. I am talking to my camera, which is above your head. So I actually can't see your face at the moment, unless I look down. And then, of course, the camera feels I'm not looking at them at all. And yeah. So it's a problem. And if you do then chip in, as I see now you're doing once or twice, it's a split second too late for me to react to it at the time when I made the point. So it's a very artificial kind of scenario, internet conversations. One day maybe it'll be absolutely perfect, but at the moment there are these limitations.
Yes, the time lag is a problem, I can see that. But I also remember with my students to teach them about the importance of feedback, back channeling and things like that. I would get them to, in pairs, have a conversation, or rather one talk to the other and tell the other, without the other one knowing, don't give any feedback. Don't nod, just look friendly, listen, but don't give any feedback, back channeling, nodding, anything like that. And it was very interesting to see how quickly those conversations broke down.
Yes, indeed they do. They break down, don't they? And people carry on talking for a little while, and then they say, "Hello, hello, are you all right?" I've done that experiment too, and people look at me and say, especially when they see my age, and they say, "You're not having a heart attack, are you?" or something like that. Or they might say, "Have I just offended you in some way?" You know, they try to interpret your lack of feedback, don't they? They
Yes.
find it a very uncomfortable situation. I agree.
Yes. Tell me a little bit more about greetings. You said that we have to greet each other at the beginning of a conversation, but there are so many different kinds of greetings. And depending on the situation, depending on the people, depending on the culture, can you tell me something about greeting?
Yes, well, you're right. There are so many variables involved here, and a lot depends on the nature of the interaction. As you say, if somebody is talking to somebody that they don't know, then that's going to be one type of scenario. If they're going to talk to somebody that they know very well, it's going to be different, and so on. The book that you mentioned earlier on, Let's Talk, it's not out yet. It should have come out last month. It's published by Oxford University Press, and they were publishing it on Shakespeare's birthday for some strange reason. Anyway, because of the pandemic, all distribution of new books has been halted or delayed, so it's not actually coming out now till July. Anyway, that's by the by. The thing is, I started the book by choosing one of the most interesting greetings that there is, which most people who haven't studied this aren't aware of. The saying, the greeting for time of day, bon dia, or good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, whatever it might be. Good night, of course, as a farewell. And when I used to talk about this, it surprised me to realize that most people aren't aware of the difference, for example, between good morning and good night. Now, good morning, when you come into a group of people and you say good morning, good morning, good morning, and you say good morning to everybody, you say it just once, don't you, to an individual person. If by some mischance you say it a second time, the person feels uncomfortable. Sorry, did you not know that you'd said it to me already? Sometimes you apologize, don't you? And you say, oh, I'm sorry, I've already said good morning to you, haven't I? So good morning is said once to a person and not twice. But when you're farewelling at the end of the day, when you're leaving and saying goodbye or saying good night or something like that, you can say that any number of times to the person. You can say good night, and then you go in, you forget something, you go into the office, you pull out what you've got, you go out and you see the person again. Oh, good night. You can say it a second time. Good night, good night, night, good night. You say that many, many times, but you don't say good morning, 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 not at least not in most normal circumstances. So the difference between good morning and good night, I think, is one of those discoveries that comes when you do, you know, the pragmatic analysis of conversation that most people are unaware of. And I must say, I was unaware of it for a long time till I started studying this subject. That's the kind of unexpected thing that crops up, isn't it?
It is. I'm thinking actually that valedictory comments like good night are interesting, but they're not necessarily the way you end the conversation. Sometimes coming to an end can be quite difficult. on the telephone or in the street if you meet somebody, it's quite difficult to wind up sometimes. You have to make several attempts at it. Oh, well, I really must be going. Or sometimes people say, well, I mustn't keep you, which means you're keeping them.
Yes, that's right. These introductory formulae and closing formulae, I spend quite a lot of time on, I collected as many as I could and I put them into the book. They really are very, very interesting. And the same problem, of course, occurs online. Now, the people watching this conversation are of two types. There are people like you and me, I suspect, where books are central. I mean, look behind me and look behind you. Books are central and the screen is marginal. But for anybody under a certain age, and I suspect a fair number of our viewers are under that age, the screen is central and books are marginal. And they're far more used to conversing online. Now, when you do this with whatever the medium is, with any instant messaging situation or WhatsApp or any sort of chat, same thing arriving is easy. Let's start the online conversation, no problem. When to end it can be quite tricky. So you're sending a message and the instant messages are coming backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards, and you want to stop the conversation without it appearing rude. And you could just switch off, of course, but deciding how to wind it down is quite tricky. And what I've noticed here is the way how some new conventions have arisen online to give, as it were, subtle clues as to the fact that the person now wants the conversation to come to an end. And one of the most interesting ones I've been looking at recently is the way the full stop, the period, has come to be used in this way. Now, normally in a WhatsApp interaction or a instant messaging exchange of some sort, for statements, you don't put a full stop at the end. There's no need. The sentences are short and you can tell that the sentence has ended because it's the edge of the screen and you're on to the next utterance. So people don't use full stops. They might use question marks and exclamation marks, but not usually full stops. And so if a full stop is used, it means something. And I've noticed two uses of this. One is to add some note of anxiety in the middle of a conversation. So, for example, I send you a message saying, I'm coming to the party tomorrow night. And you write back and say, fantastic. And I say, John's coming. Now, if I just say John's coming with no full stop, it just means John's coming. But if I say John's coming, full stop, it means, oh dear, John's coming. Something's up about John. There's an extra emotional charge. That's one use. And the other is towards the end of the conversation. You want the conversation to come to an end. You've no full stop, no full stop, no full stop. Anyway, I think it's been fantastic talking to you. Full stop means, are you ready to go now? And that's an interesting new usage, which I hadn't seen before. The full stop has taken on these new values. So it isn't just everyday conversation where your point is valid, it seems to me. It's internet as well. It
is. Right, now I have some questions here. Comment that gestures and facial expressions are important. Now, we talked about that, but they're especially important in face-to-face interaction. Question is I'd like to talk about prosody a little bit later, but is it different in phone conversation? Is it different when we can't see the person? What do we do then?
Yeah. We get into trouble, don't we? Or we have that extra level of difficulty when you rely totally on the intonation or the reduced level of prosody that comes with a telephone conversation. Then without those facial expressions and gestures, there are ambiguities indeed. And an awful lot of people don't like having telephone conversations for that very reason. I don't. I far prefer to see the face of the person. I love Skype, for example, and Zoom and things like this, notwithstanding the difficulties. And 9 times out of 10, I'd go for this kind of interaction rather than to pick up a phone and wonder what on earth the person is doing at the other end with their face and their gestures and so on. Of course, the difficulty is double then when you go into things like email and the like, where there is no prosody either. Hence the development of things like emoticons and emojis and things of that sort. But there are problems there too, of course.
Yes, I found actually that to end a conversation, such as something like a WhatsApp conversation, I find using a smiley emoticon is a good goodbye signal that I'm responding to the other person's last comment, but I don't intend to add any more. So I find the use of emoticons is good for winding up a conversation.
That's very interesting. I'm fascinated by the way emoticons, as it were, have come and gone. Such a short life they had, really, in terms of frequency of use, I mean. They are still used, of course, but not anything like the same frequency as they were a few years ago. There was a kind of novelty value, wasn't there? And everybody used them all the time, and then suddenly realized that they didn't do the job that they thought emoticons were going to do. For example, take the smiley, the friendly smiley one. Mm-hmm. You have you type something, and you think, oh, I'd better make sure that the person realizes that I'm joking and I'm happy about this. So I put a friendly smiley in at the end of my sentence. Trouble is, as people quickly realized, a smile can mean many different things. So I smile at you. What does it mean? It would mean I'm happy. Does it mean I'm being ironic? Does it mean I'm happy to see you, Mr. Bond? Smiling. I mean, there are all these types of smile, and a smile doesn't in fact disambiguate in the way people thought it was going to. And the same thing applied to all the other emoticons as well. And so there was a peak of usage, which has died away a bit now.
Yeah, well, I'm going to have to be very careful with my smiley emoticon then. I'm obviously slightly behind the times. I wanted to ask you about why conversations, face-to-face conversations, sometimes break down.
Well, for a whole range of reasons. They break down because people bring different assumptions to the conversation. They can break down for the most obvious of reasons, of course, that people say something that somebody else doesn't like. You know, the content side of things is an obvious set of factors. But assuming content is satisfactory and people are, as it were, happy to continue the conversation from a content point of view, then a whole host of reasons. One reason, people feel that they haven't been given enough time to participate. A conversation is a balanced interaction between people, depending on the number of people in the conversation. Say there are three of us, and you and I are talking here now, and we're taking up all the time, and person number three is sort of become a listener and yet wants to contribute. If there isn't that kind of balance between the three of us, then the conversation will become uncomfortable, at least. And if rated afterwards, somebody is going to say, I didn't really enjoy that conversation very much. They didn't give me a moment to say what I wanted to say. And you get that kind of thing. Very important if you're checking on the success of a conversation is to explore the feedback that people give afterwards, which will often give an indication as to the reasons for the difficulty. There must be dozens of reasons, mustn't there, Anne?
I think there are. I remember, I mean, sometimes things break down because people do too much interrupting and they feel offended by that. Or somebody just holds the floor forever and doesn't let anybody get in a word in edgeways. As far as the interruptions are concerned, a student of mine did a very interesting study analyzing conversations between people who were hard of hearing and people with good hearing. And they found that both sides were frequently interrupted. And when we analyzed the intonation, it seemed that the people who were hard of hearing tended to rely on syntactic completion, so the end of a clause, end of a sentence, as a cue to whether they could take a turn, but didn't notice prosodic clues that might suggest that the other person had more to say. And on the other way round, the person with good hearing often thought that the hard of hearing person was dropping their voice to say that they could now take a turn, but in fact it was just a natural drifting down of the pitch. Who wasn't monitoring their pitch. So I thought it was a very interesting example of how each thinks the other is being a bit rude by interrupting all the time.
Yes, that's very interesting. Now, when I was writing this book, one of the things I did was I took a corpus of conversational data that were recorded ages ago for the Survey of English Usage in London, and I analyzed the interruptions. Now, any of you who are watching this might have been to a website about style and conversation and so on, and most of them will say to you quite plainly, never interrupt. It's bad manners to interrupt. Interrupting is wrong. Well, I didn't find that at all. People interrupted each other lots of the time in these one-to-one conversations for the most part. Sometimes there were a group of 3 or 4. And so in those conversations, there were more interruptions. But in almost every case, the interruption was supportive and accepted by the person who had been interrupted. In other words, the interrupter was trying to make a genuine point that he thought would help, or she thought that the conversation would better proceed, something that you might have forgotten about, my friend. Let me add this point to what you've just been saying. Oh, yes, I hadn't realized I hadn't made that point. People were responding very sympathetically. Now, I was surprised that there were so many positive, supportive interruptions. And indeed, as I say, only in a handful of cases did somebody object and felt that, tried to withstand the interruption and to ignore the interruption. Were you expecting so many supportive interpretations like that?
No, but now you mention it, I am aware of listening to recorded conversations and noticing that overlapping speech, or what seemed perhaps like an interruption, was actually a supportive comment, and wasn't regarded as anything intrusive. But I've never really thought about how often that happens. Maybe because such conversations feel relatively smooth, and it's only the interruptions that you only notice the interruptions that are not like that. And so we don't take, not aware of them, don't notice them when they're affiliative, I suppose we would say, when they're supportive.
And these are informal conversations that I've been analyzing for the most part. I haven't been analyzing, formal debating situations where interruption would much more likely be considered to be rude. But one thing, yes?
Husbands and wives often seem to tell stories in tandem.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Yeah. But one of the things that I keep finding when I study conversation, I mean, I bet many people out there watching us will have said to themselves at some point, what can be discovered about conversation? I mean, conversation is natural and everyday, and we know what conversation is like, but as soon as you start studying it, you keep discovering these strange things. I'll give you another example now, because you just laughed, and I looked at laughter. Every now and then in the conversation, somebody laughs. Now, why do you laugh? Why would you laugh? And the answer most people will give, because I've just heard something funny. Well, that is not the reason why people laugh. I see you shaking your head. Exactly. You've had the same experience. People laugh for all sorts of reasons. A sympathetic laugh, a laugh of affirmation. I've just enjoyed what you've been hearing, what I've just been hearing from you. And hardly ever does anybody crack a joke or say something deliberately funny. like make a pun. And of course, if they make a pun, the answer is not a laugh, but usually a groan, you know, something of that kind. So laughter turns out to be a really much more sophisticated form of communication in conversation than I was expecting. And I think many other people wouldn't expect that either.
I think it's a very interesting area of study, and I think people have studied laughter in conversation, but I don't remember exactly what they found, other than it has very, very many different meanings. I've got a question here about how people are communicating now wearing face masks.
Oh. I've never studied this, and I hope that is going to be one of the areas of study. I hope people are collecting some data on this as we talk. It's tricky, isn't it? Any covering of the face, for whatever reason, there can be all sorts of reasons. There can be dark glasses. There can be a lower facial cover. There can be a complete facial cover, as in some religious systems where you only see the eyes, and so on. Now, they all take away some of the kinesic elements, some of the facial gestural elements in the conversation. And they have got to be replaced by something else. So a greater weight is now placed on the prosody, isn't it? And making your sentences a little bit more explicit, perhaps, and introducing greater clarification of certain words which otherwise might be conveyed, the meaning of which might be conveyed by the facial expression. It must alter the dynamic and the linguistic structure of what's being said to some extent. But as I say, I've not studied the mask situation yet.
Oh, and all the only comments I've heard about people wearing masks are from medical doctors and nurses who are finding it very difficult to convey empathy to their patients when only their eyes are covered, and when sometimes it's quite difficult for the patient to hear what they're saying. And so they perceive that as quite a loss.
Yes, that little smile that comes when you're trying to empathize in that way, and it's gone, hasn't it? You do the best you can with your eyes, but in medicine, of course, even the eyes can be covered sometimes with various types of goggles and glasses and things of that kind.
Yes, it's very true.
It is tricky.
I haven't actually had much of a conversation wearing a mask because we don't really wear them very much here. I did briefly when I went into a supermarket, but the only people I've seen wearing masks tend to turn away from me when they see me. So I haven't had any conversations at the moment. Sort of interaction in the street is all about people moving to one side and turning away. And
isn't that interesting? You see, I mean, turning away would normally be considered to be a rebuff.
Yes,
I do not want to talk to you anymore. You know, I turn away. No, sorry, go away. And indeed, there is that element in it. But that's why I don't like the term social distancing at all. That's being used all over the world in relation to this. It's physical distancing that we're being advised to adopt, not social distancing. On the contrary, we want as much social solidarity as possible. And just because I turn away or I'm distant from you physically does not mean that I want to be distant from you socially. And so people are having to learn a new set of norms, aren't they? And it's the terminology isn't helping.
Yeah, unfortunate that expression took hold, and a number of people have said they don't like it and it should be physical distancing, but it's just taken hold, I think. It's very difficult to shift it. I want to go back to a question based on my experience as a governor in a primary school, looking at very small children coming into school, some of whom aren't really don't understand what a conversation is. Now, often people say that it's something we learn. And my question is, first of all, how do we learn it? And why is it perhaps that some children are not learning it and have to be taught what a conversation is when they come to school?
Yeah, very interesting. Conversation in child language acquisition has had quite a large literature, really, I suppose, over the years. And the pragmatics of conversation have begun to be explored quite a bit. Now, how does it start? Well, you have to, first of all, analyze what are the most important properties. What are the basic principles of conversation, the most fundamental things that there are in a conversation, and expect that these are likely to be the ones that's going to turn up earliest. And what is the most basic thing about a conversation? Well, it's turn taking. The fact that there are two people, one is talking to the other and there is a response. So they're taking turns. Anybody who's read up on this will perhaps remember there's a metaphor called the conversational ball. So I hold the conversational ball while I'm talking, then I pass it over to you, and then you can talk, and then you send it back to me, and then I can talk, and so on. Now, turn taking has been very well studied in relation to the first year of life, because what people like Colwyn Trevarthen and others up in Edinburgh have discovered when they videotaped long stretches of interaction between a little infant, just 3 months of age, and its mother, or sometimes other caretaker, is that there is a turn-taking teaching situation going on. So, for instance, the mother is feeding the baby, and it goes something like this. The baby is crying, and the mother comes up and says, "Oh, are you hungry? You're hungry. Yes, you are, you are, you are. Come on now, let's have some food. Let's have some food." And she's chatter, 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 until the baby gets the teat or the bottle into its mouth. And at that point, the mother shuts up. And the glug, 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 glug. And then after a little while, the baby has enough food, or the mother thinks the baby's had enough. The baby comes off the bottle or the teat. And then there's a little winding situation going on, isn't there? And while the winding situation is going on, the mother is chatting, saying, "Oh, yes, come on now, let's hear that little windy bubble. Oh, yes," then goes the child. "Ah, good boy, that's right, lovely little windy bubble." Now, there's a turn taking there. Mother waits for the windy bubble to come up. Up comes the burp. The baby has responded, as it were, and the baby then gets a response from the mother. And so there is a turn taking situation evolving here, of mother chat versus silence. Mother chat, silence. Contribute, if you like, baby, with a burp or a cry earlier on, or some satisfied noises after a little while. And while you're making those noises, your mum will not be saying anything. So basic turn taking is emerging there. And then as the games become more sophisticated during the first year of life, the turn taking becomes more sophisticated as well. So if you're playing build and bash games with a pile of bricks, or tickling games under the arm, these are all turn-taking games. Even the simple matter of changing a nappy, or a diaper, as some Americans call it. The simple matter of changing a nappy has a turn-taking element within it. So turn-taking is one of the big things that is established in the first year of life. Now, if for some reason, and it becomes more sophisticated as language starts to be used. Now, if something goes wrong with that kind of interaction, then I can easily imagine a situation where children are not sure when to speak, or if they should speak, or is it my turn, and some sort of anxiety might come in, and the problem you mentioned might then arise.
It seems to me that it arises in the language period of turn taking, where people are using language a lot. And it seems that some of these children have only heard commands. They haven't had any kind of interaction that requires a response other than to stop doing something or to do something. And that's my observation anyway. And it saddens me that I see that the nurturing nursery teachers sit the children down and teach them about saying something and then waiting for the other person to say something, and then it's your turn. So sometimes it can go wrong. I suppose I'm saying this because it's so easy to say we learn it naturally. from childhood.
You only learn it naturally if you're given the opportunity to learn it naturally. And this means two things. First of all, it means directed conversation. In other words, directed language to the child. It's no good the child just sitting there while around you there's conversation going on in the background or on the television or whatever it might be. A child is not going to pick up conversation that way. No, it's got to be directed. You've got to talk to the person. Look at me when I'm talking to you, is something we adults say. And it's the same with the kids. And so putting the child down in front of a television and assuming, oh, some other video game or whatever it is not going to initiate a conversational interaction. And those people who have studied this do seem to find that an awful lot of kids, as it were, are left to their own devices. Gets worse, of course, the more kids there are in the family, or the more other people are involved in a noisy environment, for instance, with people coming and going, other kids shouting, the Hoover going on in the background and so on. It's very difficult sometimes to give the amount of attention to an individual child which will enable that kind of conversational comfort to emerge.
So it's very important, really, the way children are nurtured at a young age to learn this kind of interactive communication.
And we're talking about the early part of the second year of life, really, for the most part, throughout the second year.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of stages of language acquisition, between 12 months to 18 months, most babies have just one-word sentences, you know, dada, go, come, there, teddy, and so on. Round about 18 months, they start putting two words together and saying things like daddy, go, want more, where teddy, and the like. And that's the point at which the importance of interaction, of turn-taking, is critical, because in a normal and ideal conversation, what happens is something like this. The child says, teddy gone. The mother then says, and most mothers or fathers or caretakers will react like this. They'll say, yes, Teddy's gone, hasn't he? Where's Teddy gone to? Notice what's happening there. Teddy gone, says the child. Yes, Teddy's gone, says the parent. Expanding the sentence, showing the child, not correcting the child, not saying, oh dear child, you have said Teddy gone. You shouldn't have said that. You should have said Teddy has gone. You know, that's no. Just doing it by showing the child a better model. It's called expansion in the language acquisition literature. Doing that and then expanding and saying something else. Yes, Teddy's gone. He's gone behind the chair. Showing the child not just that what the child has said is good, but that there's something else the child might have said. And this gives the kid an indication of how the conversation can develop. Because in a real conversation, we don't just say, for those of you who have learned English as a second language or learned any foreign language as a second language, the conversations there are bizarre, aren't they? Sometimes I speak, the other person speaks. I speak, the other person speaks. We say one sentence each. It's nice and balanced all the way down the language teaching chapter. It's not like that in every day, is it, Anne, at all?
It is not like that in every day. It's unfortunately not only like that in some language, especially the older language textbooks, it's like that in some kinds of research into human conversation that tries to record people doing idealized conversations and then telling you how it works and the prosody of it. So that kind of artificial conversation is unfortunately behind some research that I find research tending to be aimed towards speech technology.
And questions, you know, in so many of the dialogues I've seen in language teaching materials, it's question and answer, question and answer, question and answer, as in classrooms, indeed. Well, that doesn't happen very often in the data that I've been analyzing. People don't have a conversation of an evening with questions going all around the floor and answers that everybody's making statements to each other and bouncing off each other. Occasionally the odd question here and there, but it's not the routine of question and answer that you so often see in teaching situations.
No, that's right. Now, I'm going to ask you a question that's come in It's how you see the future of group conversations on Zoom.
Well, isn't that an interesting one? And this is another one. I've never researched this. How could I have? How could any of us have? Zoom has really only come into the forefront of our attention in the last few weeks. Oh, it was there before. And I remember once using Zoom for something. But there are so many other environments, like online rooms of one kind and another, Adobe and all the others. And I've been involved in several of them, but in a sporadic kind of way. Never noticed, never before has there been the opportunity to interact regularly using Zoom in the way that you and I are doing now. So this is a huge, new, wonderfully exciting area for research. Any of you out there who are looking for a good research project, this is one. What on earth is going on in a Zoom set of interactions? How many of us could we handle in this way without the conversation becoming really difficult? How do you guarantee that everybody has the opportunity to interact in this way? Just yesterday, I was involved in a Zoom conversation on Shakespeare with a Shakespeare class, with a class over in Tennessee. So in front of me, there were a dozen students and the teacher and two teachers, and I was making points and the teacher was asking questions and so on. And after a while, the teacher said, well, now, has anybody got any questions for David? Now, nobody immediately answered because nobody quite knew whether they should or what would happen if they started and somebody else wanted to come in at the same time. And for my part, I had no idea when somebody did ask a question where they were. I mean, there were 12 screens there. Who was asking the question? It takes me a while to find out. And I don't know. So there's a primitivism about this, isn't there? We're not yet at the stage where Zoom conversations can be as naturally effective as I'm sure one day they will be. At the moment, it's all pretty basic and rather clunky.
Yes. Have you experienced with other kinds of online conversations?
I have, and they're not much different. You know, the same problems are recurring. All these conversations with the new technology are artificial to that extent. I mean, it's the same with talking to robots, isn't it? I have a chapter in the book on talking to robots and the kind of interaction that we might expect. If only they were like Dave and Hal in 2001, which is a lovely, natural, hello, Dave. Yes, this is Hal here. I think you're being all this, that kind of lovely, natural conversation. We're miles away, kilometers away from that kind of interaction at the moment.
Well, I don't speak to robots very often. So I haven't had that experience. Do you think that the younger generation are better at it, could be better at it in future? Are they going to learn to deal with it much more easily than we are in our age?
Well, yes, I think they are, inevitably. It's their world. They are native speakers of this technology, as it were, whereas you and I were second language learners of it. But even they, I mean, I do talk to them about this. I've talked to my first generation children who are all in their sort of 40s and so on now. They're not much better than me at it. I've talked to my grandchildren who are now, some of them in their sort of, 15, 16, 17 sort of age. They say they're having difficulty with it as well. In other words, the technology is not yet sufficiently malleable, sufficiently flexible to enable them to carry on the kind of conversation that they would have in an everyday circumstance. And certainly the robotic side of things, the interaction that they get if they do use a conversation with a machine. The machine itself is miles away from the kind of conversation that you and I would have every day. And to take a simple example, it doesn't give simultaneous feedback. To take another example, it doesn't use the filler phrases that you and I find so important in making a conversation sound natural. Phrases like, you know, you see, I mean, mind you, to be perfectly honest, you know, when did you last hear a machine talk like that? You didn't, and they don't. And that's one of the things that teenagers and others in the younger generation finds especially important. They use these expressions all the time, more than too much, some adults would say, especially with a word like, you know, which is very, very frequent. And yet it's an oil that makes their conversation flow smoothly. And that oil is missing in the robotic world at the moment.
Yes. Well, I think that's quite comforting, because that suggests that it's not just because we're not used to it, but because the technology is really not doing what we have learned to do and what makes human interaction work smoothly. We are
a long way to go, a long way to go.
Working against the technology, really, rather than with it. It's helping us to do some things like having this kind of conversation, but it isn't advanced enough, really, for us not to consider it as a slightly awkward conversation.
Yes, that's right. It's missing out so much of the social cement, as it were, that makes the conversation really, really comfortable. It's the same with the translation devices. You know, if you're translating from Brazilian Portuguese into English, and you're either doing it with Google Translate, or maybe if you've got one of the really modern things that you can plug into your ear, then what if you keep it to simple, basic sentences, it's not too bad. But as soon as you start breaking your sentence up by making it sound more natural, the system collapses. Oh, it's short term, you know, in 100 years' time, it'll be fine.
I think the interesting thing here is that on the one hand, we're saying that the technology isn't really there for us to have natural conversations with one another. But on the other hand, I'm sure that when we have sort of human-machine interaction, when we're talking to, I don't know, a telling machine or a voice an automatic voice on the telephone, do we really want them to sound natural? Isn't it going to be a bit creepy?
Yeah, yes, that's right. Yeah, and I remember there's been a fair bit of research recently on what accent, what regional accent would you like your machine to speak to you in? There was a lovely piece of research a few years ago, I think it was in New Zealand, where a medical machine, a machine that was giving responses about advice about prescriptions and diagnosis and things like that. They programmed the machine to respond in a British English accent, a New Zealand accent, and I think an American accent. I forget exactly. Anyway, you see the point. Various accents. And then they asked the people to rate the believability of the response. Would they actually act on the response? And the results were absolutely clear cut, that if it was a New Zealand accent, accommodation was taking place and they believed what the machine was saying, 100%. If it was a British accent, it was down a bit, but still pretty strong. An American accent, no, didn't believe it at all, you know, that kind of thing. And of course, the results would be very different in America, you see, where certain types of American accent would be rated as 100% and other types less so. So this is all a new world, isn't it? And it's hardly been researched yet. And it's such an exciting world that young people, young researchers, linguists these days are able to enter into.
Are you aware of cultural differences in conversational conventions? I'm thinking, for example, of cultures where silences are more tolerated. I don't know whether it's just whether it's true or not, but I have a feeling that in Finland, conversations will be comfortable with a bit of silence, whereas when we have a conversation, a silence is awkward and you feel duty bound to fill it. I've also I'm aware of some cultures where it's regarded, especially in where there's a difference in power between the speakers, that it's regarded as rude to look to the superior person in the eye while they're talking to you, whereas in here, it's rude not to. You have teachers saying, look at me when I'm talking to you. Some cultures, I think that's regarded as insolent.
Yeah. No, I share your sense there completely. I've got a chapter on cultural differences in the book, and I just selected some examples from the worlds that I've been into where people react in different ways. And it affects absolutely everything. It affects, yes, silence and pause, certainly one of the variables here. Types of greeting, types of farewell, they're involved as well. One of the most important distinctions I've discovered, I encountered, because I didn't discover it, I mean, it's been discussed a lot, is how quickly do you get to the point of your conversation? So you and I are having a conversation, and it's about some topic that is of mutual interest. And I say, you know, hello, and how are you today? And you're fine, thanks, how are you? And we perhaps have a little bit of phatic communion, a bit of, unimportant conversation for a few seconds. And then we get to the point. This is a good, Anglo-Saxon thing, isn't it? We'll get to the point as quickly as possible. When I was in several countries, when I was in Japan, for instance, this was quite not the thing to do. The initial interaction where one talks about each other and life and the environment and the cherry blossom lovely and so on went on for quite a period of time before my Japanese colleagues felt that, yes, now is the time to get on with the conversation. And the British person, is saying, let's get on with it, let's get on with it, let's get on with it. And the Japanese person is saying, no. And conversely, a Japanese person entering into a British conversation might feel uncomfortable that the conversation had got underway without the participants having shown that mutual empathy. And everywhere I go, I find differences of this kind. It's a hugely interesting area of research, isn't it? Cultural differences.
It seems to be, and I remember reading a long time ago that it could have quite serious consequences. For example, in legal settings, in courtrooms, where somebody was accused of something, but this person was from a different culture from the people who were judging. And they might be judged as evasive, when in fact they were having to be indirect because that was their culture, or hesitating, or perhaps not saying something because they didn't want to answer or couldn't answer. I remember a fellow student, rather a long time ago, unfortunately, who was in a class with me, and the professor asked him a question, and he said nothing. And we were all very embarrassed and uncomfortable, and said afterwards, why didn't you say something? And he said, well, I didn't have anything to say. That was the first experience of thinking something's going wrong here. So I think sometimes it's just uncomfortable in, when we need to learn about different cultures, if we're going to do business, for example, in other cultures. But there could be situations where the consequences are quite severe. If you do something that is regarded as insolent to your superior, when in fact you think you're being modest and looking down when they're telling you off, and they think you're being rude and evasive, you can lose your job. So in the courtroom situation, in educational situations, where people are being judged, even in interviews, for example, there may well be more serious consequences to these cultural differences.
Yes, two very good examples there, and absolutely the legal situation with interpreters and the like, and the business world. It can be very, very serious. I've felt discomfort often myself, not knowing why somebody has failed to respond, or giving a lecture even, In some parts of the world, I give a lecture, I say, any questions? And there are no questions. I think that's very, very strange. And I say, no, surely, and I try to jolly them along, you know, and they don't ask questions. And so we close the session. And then afterwards, they come up to me and ask all sorts of questions. And when I discovered this, I would ask them, you know, why didn't, just like you said, why didn't you ask me a question? And there were two reasons. One was that in some cultures, to ask a question is not an inquiry out of intelligence. It is an admission of ignorance. And therefore, if you ask the question, you lose face immediately, because it's basically saying you do not know. And who wants to be the first to admit to not knowing something? And that was a problem. And then the other thing I discovered was that in many situations where there's a mixed audience of students and lecturers and professors and so on, the students don't ask first because it's not their place to ask first. It is for the professor to ask first. And if the professor does not, that indicates that they should not as well. And so there are all these differences, aren't there? And you just got to learn about them, and you can try and break them down a bit to some extent, but you don't usually succeed in my experience.
No, it probably only succeeds if you are able to make it explicit, if there is a point at which you can say, oh, you find it unusual to do this, but in my culture, it's perfectly okay to do such. If you know what the differences are, even though I think one's first response is always to be offended and then say, oh, but it's different. You rationalize it afterwards. It's very difficult not to actually be offended first.
And it applies to subject matter as well, doesn't it? It occurs to me while you're talking. In everyday conversation, to go back to where we were at the beginning, you know, what are, you say, remember you asked me about when conversations break down. Well, you know, one of the reasons is when, for cultural reasons, somebody chooses a topic of conversation that culturally would be okay in their culture, but is totally unacceptable in the other culture. I guess I've made cultural errors like this in other countries, but I recall examples of the other way round. In our culture, for example, it's not appropriate really to ask about the cost of the furnishings in your room, for instance. You know, somebody comes in and you say, oh, how much did this cost? You know, one would feel a little uncomfortable there. But in some other cultures, it would be insulting not to ask about the cost of the furnishings in the room. And if you didn't, there'd be trouble. Or in a meal, you know, you're in our culture, you're supposed to say something like, this is absolutely lovely, darling, or Mrs. Jones, or whatever. Really enjoying this. Thank you. You comment on the food. That's okay. But I've been in cultures where if you comment on the food, I've actually had this happen to me. I said, as I was saying, this is really very nice, I said to my host, and the host said, you don't like it, and took it away and replaced it, because to comment on the food meant that you noticed that there was something wrong with it. And I was completely baffled by that. So
and very hungry, no doubt. I'm sure you were hungry, not
yes.
but hungry. Well, on that other interesting note, I think our time is more or less up.
Oh, I suppose it is.
And I think I would like to thank you for engaging in this conversation with me. I think there is an awful lot more to be said about conversation. However simple and straightforward we think it is, it's clearly a very complex issue that has the power to bring people together and the power to do the opposite.
Yes, absolutely. It's a fascinating subject. And we've been talking, of course, almost entirely about English. Well, everything we've said about English applies to Brazilian Portuguese as well, and to any language indeed. And I hope that more and more people will explore this absolutely fascinating subject. Well, thank you too, Anne, and also to Miguel for arranging this and giving this opportunity to be in touch with everybody over there. And I hope there'll be another occasion one day.